Around midnight on the 19th of November 1941, after a desperate battle with the German raider Kormoran, the Australian cruiser H.M.A.S Sydney was last seen limping over the horizon. She was burning fiercely from stem to stern. Neither she nor any of her crew were ever seen again. On February the 6th, 1942, a Kali float was found drifting off Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, south of Java. On it was a badly decomposed body that may have been the only remains ever found of the ill-fated Sydney's 645-man crew. What really happened that night so long ago remains one of the world's great unsolved maritime mysteries.
The Australian people had a very special feeling for the ships called Sydney. The first Sydney in World War I was the first Australian ship to be successful in battle when she sank the Emden at Cocos Island. And the feeling transferred to the second Sydney.
H.M.A.S Sydney was a modified Leander-class light cruiser. It was laid down in 1934 and completed the following year. It was armed with 6-inch guns, 2 turrets forward, 2 turrets aft, and really was a very modern ship.
As the Sydney started her service career, her destiny was being formulated by momentous events unfolding on the European continent. HMAS Sydney, under the command of Captain John Collins, had already answered the call, joining the British fleet for operations in the Mediterranean. To combat the might of the British Navy, the Germans concentrated on submarine warfare and warships disguised as merchant shipping. Like chameleons, these ships would change their appearance at will and were commonly known as raiders. First used by the British and Germans in World War I, raiders used their camouflage to lure unsuspecting ships that were then either sunk or taken as prizes. One of these raiders was the Steiermark, later renamed Kormoran.
Really, it was a ship that tried to maintain all of the conventional merchant ship lines and design, and within the hull, though, it was converted to have spaces for prisoners of war and also for guns. There were 5.9-inch guns which were concealed within the hull itself, and flaps could be operated and the guns then swung outboard, trained and fired on ships. It also had a vast array of smaller arms which were spread across the upper decks with different sorts of camouflage hiding them from view of Allied ships.
In early December of 1940, the Kormoran broke through the Allied blockade and out into the Atlantic Ocean.
Ein Kameramann der Marine-PK bei der Arbeit. deutsche Flagge weht über dem Ozean.
The Sydney was returning from Sunda Strait when the two ships finally met off Shark Bay late on the afternoon of November 19th. Kormoran was now disguised as the Dutch merchantman Strat Malacca. She would have recognized Sydney as the enemy immediately. On the Sydney, the Kormoran's identity was yet to be established. Of the Kormoran's crew of nearly 400, 318 were to survive. The Sydney's fate was unknown.
This was the greatest tragedy during the Second World War that hit the Royal Australian Navy. And there wouldn't have been a family or a community that wasn't touched by the loss of some 645 men, their wives, their children, their parents, across Australia.
The whole country was in a state of shock for weeks afterwards.
We couldn't believe. We couldn't believe it. And of course, as the days went on, it was just terrible.
I lost many good friends in Sydney, and I feel that I was extraordinarily fortunate not to have been with them when it happened. Lucky Ross, I am. I still often wake up at night and get the shakes and think, well, golly, by the law of averages, I shouldn't be here.
I know of some sailors, mothers, that kept their bed, kept new clean sheets on the bed for months and months, waiting for their boys to come home.
You know, it was a terrible shock to her, and you know, I know that she did, you know, cry at night for many months after the occurrence.
Several days after the battle with the Sydney, survivors from the Kormoran began to be picked up by passing ships or to struggle ashore on the Australian coast.
Now, Captain Titmus, perhaps you'd be so good to describe to us what happened from when you first sighted the Sydney.
The Kormoran was armed with 6-inch guns. When I first saw Sydney, I did not know what ship she was. As she turned broadside on, I realized she was a H.M.A.S cruiser and quite expected to be sunk.
If you go to sea in a war and on a armed merchant ship, you know what your fate might be. So we knew that it would be our hour. Serious.
But then we asked to hoist the signal letters, and that was the signal which Allied merchant ships had only for a journey, especially from the Navy, and we had none. So the war flag went up the mast, and the guns came out.
I opened fire.
Our hits were reasonably accurate. You could hear on the crying of the artillerymen and so on. And then it went on, and was one of the lucky shots the first time too. And it was too close.
I saw, for instance, when she was hit by a torpedo, that the front of the ship sank very deep and eventually got up again. You saw the guns, front guns were silent very soon, but the guns in the back of the ship were still firing for quite a while. You saw the people running on deck. Most of them probably would be caught in the machine gun fire.
And that these smaller guns, about inch anti-aircraft, they kept the deck clean. See, that's as close they were to it. They shot anything to pieces with what was moving there.
The action then broke off. I had been badly hit and was making preparations to abandon my ship.
Well, the Sydney was on fire, right over from the front to the back. And the fire must have been pretty severe. And he was burning for many hours till he really disappeared altogether.
Then, just before I abandoned ship, I looked for the Sydney, but she was gone. All was blackness. I could do nothing to save them.
And the last boat was Detmer's boat. He was the last one to leave. In the meantime, charges have been laid to sink the ship, which was one of the best fireworks I've ever seen.
It seems inconceivable that the Sydney, whose motto was thorough and ready, would have approached an unidentified ship without being on full alert.
Well, 6-inch guns were pointed at the Kormoran. Other guns were not, except the torpedo tubes were.
She was first on a completely battle station. And then apparently there was some more liberty, because there was movement on deck, and you saw the people going hither and thither, and so somebody could not be on a battle station. They relaxed, apparently.
Maybe it was a holiday they had, and maybe the lieutenant said, okay, he asked who he is, he comes from, and he didn't look suspicious to him.
Actually, you saw people standing on deck and watching us. which was more or less like a friendly meeting somewhere in the ocean.
This then is the German account. Not everyone, however, believes their story. To begin with, just why did the Sydney come so close? Was Burnett duped, or did he have other factors to consider?
It was known from previous actions in 1941 that British and Allied sailors had been killed when raiders had been sunk. Captain Burnett really had no choice but to come towards the ship, given that Kormoran was fumbling the signal flags and making some show of her attempts to reply to Sydney's request for her international signal letters. I believe that Sydney came close and that in the end he decided to board the ship.
Absolute crap and delusion. I know the men on the ship. He didn't identify the raider at all. Absolute rubbish. I know the man who hoisted the ready signal. The Germans aren't lying to me. As one joked to me, 120 of us couldn't tell you the same story. That's drivel.
We clearly could see people just standing on the railing.
The suggestion that Captain Burnett was incompetent or that he was somehow a bleeding heart and wasn't up to the rigours of war really is something that I do not accept. I've only heard these sorts of allegations uttered by one person, and I don't accept them.
As a minor in itself, but major in its significance, indication that Sydney was not at action stations was Detmer's comment that the cooks were standing around in their white uniforms looking at us.
I saw a few which probably were kitchen hands or something like that. They were wearing an apron, one or two of them. So I think myself they probably were working in the kitchen, just had a look and see what kind of ship it was.
Well, Captain Detmer's suggestion that there were cooks and stewards and all sorts of people wandering about the upper deck of Sydney, enjoying the sights of seeing another merchant ship that afternoon, in my mind are so implausible as to suggest some major doubts about the reconstruction of the action as supplied by Captain Detmer's. It seems to me that she was flying the Dutch flag, that Sydney had come close in preparation for boarding, and that Captain Detmer's fired a torpedo from the starboard underwater tube. While that torpedo was on its way to Sydney, he then gave the order to decamouflage and then fired. By firing a torpedo while flying the Dutch flag was prima facie a war crime. It was a breach of the Hague Conventions, which said that if you were to fire on an enemy, it had to be under your own flag.
Now, there are rumours that Detmer's fired a torpedo at Sydney while still sailing under the Dutch flag and thereby committed a war crime. That is the product of ignorance, delusion and stupidity.
You cannot fire an underwater torpedo in our ship with the ship moving. It's not possible. You must stop your ship and then you can shoot the underwater torpedo. It was not shot.
The underwater torpedo was not fired, no, never.
I decided very early in my research not to interview the Kormoran survivors. I did that consciously because I believe you really couldn't put great store on recollections which were more than 50 years old.
You've got to go to Germany to find out. You've got to speak to the men.
Whether the Germans have lied all these years or not.
How could the ship be lost? How could 7,000 tons of cruiser and 645 men just vanish and leave a Carly float? How could that happen? It really is unprecedented in naval warfare.
If some men got off in the water, the first thing is that there would have been blood in the water. And the second thing is that it was Shark Bay.
And you could see them swimming in the waves. And as soon as we went down, we could see them about half a meter higher than our board was. A friend of mine climbed out of the boat and went into the water. And I thought, gosh, what's going on with him? I pulled him in. What are you doing? Oh, I was going to the bakery over there, getting some rye bread. I said, come in. He was completely gone. He shouldn't have done it. He was lucky that he didn't do it when no sharks were around.
He said, sharks? He said there were hundreds of them, just hundreds of them. So I've never seen like it in my years at sea. That's why I think there are no survivors. It was simply not possible for survivors to exist. And if there had been any, they'd have needed to be rescued within the first 24 hours to give them a sporting chance of being found. There's no mystery about it to me at all.
To add to the horrors that might have met any survivors in the water is the incredible delay before a search was mounted.
The search vessels were sent out the moment that it was realised that Sydney was missing. That wasn't realised until the Aquitania gave the alarm when she landed the survivors that she had subsequently picked up and landed them round at Wilson's Promontory off Victoria. And that was a few days after the event.
Oh, it's very obvious that there was a big cover-up right from the start. From when the Sydney went missing, it was 5 days before anything was done.
The mystery surrounding the fate of the Sydney has so fascinated people that there is even an organisation calling themselves the Sydney Research Group that have dedicated themselves to finding out the truth. Gordon Laffer and others recall sighting or hearing distress signals from the Sydney.
The first page was an RAAF signals form written in red pencil, and it had Sydney calling Darwin, Sydney calling Darwin, on fire, fore and aft, preparing to abandon ship.
Fire, fore and aft, yeah.
So I took the file back and I said to him, one question, why didn't you send out a aeroplane from Geraldton, which was a service flying training school with Avro Ants and twin-engine bombers? And he said, we told them straight away after we got the message, and all they said was, the Sydney is not overdue. And he said that was that. We couldn't buy into it without something from them.
That has come up subsequently, and there are no records that a signal was actually sent.
Sydney Research Group sounds a good name. Unfortunately, they don't do very much research. They just listen to people gossiping. A lot of what they have said is wrong, but there may in fact have been a signal. Most of the rest, they're just old men looking for an excuse to support their fantasies.
Perhaps the most disturbing story of all comes from Jack Hazelwood, who left the Sydney only 6 weeks before her sinking. Jack recounts a meeting in 1943 with the captain and 2 officers of a lighthouse tender called the Cape Otway. Perhaps significantly, its log ends abruptly on the 18th of November 1941, just 1 day before the Sydney was lost. The log only resumes some months later.
Now, I met the captain and these 2 officers in the Freemason Arms Hotel in Albany. And they said, would you have a drink? And I said I'd be delighted. So we spoke about ships and so on. And the captain asked me...
What ship? You were on the Sydney?
The captain looked at me for a while and then he looked at his 2 officers.
Shall I tell him?
He said to these 2 officers, will I tell him? The Cape Otway was sent to search for survivors.
We came across all these bodies, Australian sailors. We contacted the Navy and said we found all these bodies and debris and floating in the water, and what do we do? And they came back and said, are there any survivors? There were no survivors. They were all dead and just floating.
Then the Navy radioed back to this captain, leave the area instantly. Carry on with your normal duties. Do not touch anything. Just go. Now, I just wonder why the Navy has ever denied that that was done.
I can't believe that we as a Navy would have done that, particularly as the ships were out there searching, and that's exactly what they were searching for.
In the case of the USS Indianapolis, which sank in 12 or 13 minutes with 900 or so people into the water out of 1,200, they found the survivors, or they were detected accidentally after about 80 hours or so. In the next 12 hours, they picked up the 300 survivors, and they then spent the best part of a week systematically clearing the area, removing all the debris and sinking all the bodies.
Could it be that the Australian Navy sank bodies from the Sydney for the sake of public morale? And if there were survivors in the water after the battle, what happened to them during the first crucial few hours?
I think they shot them. I think the evidence of the Carly float in the War Museum, riddled with bullet holes, Montgomery said there was a heck of a lot of them.
The motives for the Kormoran survivors, giving an account other than what actually happened, is not too difficult to divine, because as breakers of international law, they would have been held to have been common pirates who were, as such, liable to summary execution, which was surely a sufficient motive in itself.
Petty Officer Jurgensen and Lieutenant von Gosselin committed a war crime.
Even today, in theory at any rate, they would still be liable to war crimes charges.
We always say, these Australians, they were brave soldiers, they were brave chaps or brave men. But we are no murderers.
We know that in the interrogations, particularly with Lieutenant Commander Rycroft, who was the senior intelligence officer in Fremantle, that his unshakable opinion was that they were all, the survivors were all telling lies. They'd all been told to tell lies, and they told lies.
Unfortunately, there's no survivor of the Sydney. And personally, I believe, whatever we say, there's probably always somebody who thinks up his own story. Also, he never was there. In many cases, probably doesn't even know what the difference is between sea and land.
One Carly float is known to have come from the Sydney. The Australian War Memorial has scientifically tested it.
Our assumption is that the Carly float was shot at by high explosive munitions which exploded relatively close, and those pieces of munitions were either captured in the cork or the body of the float or went through it. But they were high explosive shells. They were definitely not machine gun bullets.
We really have seen the shoddiest practice of history from both Michael Montgomery and the Sydney Research Group.
They say that the Germans bribed me to write the book, but in fact I haven't done this to defend the Germans. I have done it because I have been so ashamed and humiliated by the mean-spiritedness of some Australians, and I felt it was up to someone to set the record straight.
Australians, I must say, that appear to be bad losers. Not fair.
But the controversy surrounding the loss of the Sydney doesn't end there. The Sydney was lost just 18 days before Pearl Harbor.
Some people believe there were survivors of the Sydney. that they're prisoners in Japan. What do you think of that?
In my opinion, the Sydney had been hit by me at a vital spot, and the fire had reached the magazine, and she blew up and sank. I do not think there could have been any survivors.
There's a very obvious purpose for a Japanese submarine being in the same area as the Kormoran, and that was to lie in wait for the Aquitania, which was on her way to pick up 4,000 troops to take back to Malaya, and so would have been a very tempting target for the Japanese. 4,000 troops could, in their eyes, have made all the difference between success and failure in the invasion of Malaya.
It wasn't in Japan's interests to go after one relatively minor Australian ship at that time, when the whole fate of the Japanese Empire was at stake. The whole effort was directed to strike a secret attack on Pearl Harbor.
Recent evidence indicates that Japanese naval codes had been broken by the British, and that Churchill knew of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor and was counting on it to bring the Americans into the war.
If the Japanese had any suspicion at all that their plans were known or their codes were being read, there's no doubt that they would have cancelled the Pearl Harbor operation. That is one of the reasons why the cover-up on Sydney came about in the first place.
There is unfortunately one great problem with the Australian archives, that they are very tightly controlled by the British government.
Churchill's Far East files, which are conceded by certain elements of the United States intelligence and Australian intelligence and British intelligence itself, were placed on a 75-year hold in 1945.
And you begin to wonder to yourself, you know, is Australia in charge of its own history? See, the whole of the Automaton story and the betrayal of Australian troops in Singapore only came to light because I happened to stumble across it in an American archive. And when Mr. Keating raised this point some time ago, in Britain, of course, there was a sort of big outcry about, oh, Keating doesn't know his history, leave it all to us, we know what happened. Actually, Mr. Keating knew his history far better than the British, because he's never been in a British archive.
Australia was deceived by Churchill because we were going to be, if you like, colloquially, the bunny. We were not important enough.
People want to know. There's a substantial amount of interest amongst ordinary Australians to know what happened to this ship. The ship that was once the darling of the RAN, the pride of the nation.
After all, the academics, authors, historians, journalists, politicians and researchers have finished trying to put the egg back together again, we come back to the people who were actually on the ships that fought so gallantly for their respective countries, and their thoughts and feelings.
And what your feelings are, you have to digest it by yourself. It's not a nice thing. I would say, who likes to destroy something valuable, whatever it is? If it is a ship, it is a nice piece of technology and so on today that goes down in the bottom. You know what a waste. Was it worth it?
I've never technically shed an outward tear for Sydney. Many internally, yes. It was the greatest tragedy in World War II, in my opinion, but of course I may be a little parochial about that one. And I think the tragedy of it is that it was one of these things that should never have happened. That's what makes it so tragic and so sad.